All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I hope you enjoy the food and everything else. Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm really happy you came. I'm really proud of this latest book that I have coming out. It's my most ambitious book to date, and it's really unique in both the content and the style and the way that I'm bringing it out to the world. So you probably know that I published 4 other books in the class, 5 you count a second edition of one. There's the Brotherhood Chronicle, which is a international crime trilogy, mainly with Asian American themes, set in New York City, India, Thailand, Australia, and that's one of my series. The other series, which Bad Americans is part of, is called The Human Tragedy. And the first book is Good Americans. That's a short story collection with 6 short stories, a 3-part novella, and a provocative introduction. It's an anthology series, so the 2 books aren't related in terms of having similar characters, but they are thematically kind of inverse. And so I'll give you a little bit of a background on both this book and The Human Tragedy and what I'm trying to do with it. So The Human Tragedy is basically the modern day equivalent of the human comedy, which Honoré de Balzac, a French writer, wrote about Paris in the 19th century. He lived for about 51 years. He was born in 1799 to a kind of aristocratic family in Paris, and or somewhere near Paris, and he died in 1850. Anyway, within those 51 years, he actually wrote over 100 books, and those are mostly about the contemporary Parisian society. And for the time, he was very dynamic because he kind of created his own printing press. He actually kind of failed as a publisher, and as a businessman, and as a politician, and all these things. And his failure is actually what kind of drives the books and what makes the books so great. But anyway, so what I wanted to do was kind of create the same thing with New York City. That's where I'm born, that's where I'm raised, that's what I know so well, especially Queens, but also outside of it. So I had kind of like 2 different aesthetic leanings. I had the novels. So with the novels, I wanted to write the crime noir, and the thrillers, which I admire so much. And so that's where I wrote the Brotherhood Chronicle, the international crime trilogy. But I also like writing short stories, and I also like writing vignettes and real life, depictions and portraits. And that's where I came up with The Human Tragedy. And so Good Americans is the first one of that, and Bad Americans is the second. Now specifically Bad Americans, I always wanted to write this kind of version of the Decameron, basically a short story collection where there's like a frame story. I first was introduced, I think probably the Canterbury Tales actually, which is very similar, where a bunch of pilgrims in 15th century England are taking a pilgrimage, and they're all from all different professions and backgrounds, and they each tell stories, and each story is in a different style, has a different subject, kind of reflects their time, right? Later on, when I was studying abroad at the University of Oxford, I remember going to Blackwell's bookshop there, and I discovered the Decameron, which was even older. It was from Italy. It was from 14th century Italy, written by an author named Giovanni Boccaccio, and he lived through the Black Death, which was one of the worst pandemics in history, specifically in Florence. And 5 years after the Black Death, he published the Decameron, which is about 10 aristocrats who flee Florence to go to the countryside during the Black Death to avoid it. And for 10 nights, they each tell 10 stories, so there are 100 stories. And then within those nights, there are also telling each other love poetry and whatever, kind of commingling. So I always wanted to do something like that. I don't know. It was just a narrative ambition, let's just say. And so And I was actually planning, so what happened is that I was publishing the Butler Chronicle in the late 2010s. 2018 was the second edition of the Butler came out, 2019 the Run and Hide came out, the second book, and then 2020 the Dance Towards Death came out. So I was busy doing that, and my next project was going to be Bad Americans. And I already had the idea to do it during a pandemic, and to do a stories based around it. But in this case, it was actually going to be set, I think, in a library or something like that, where people were, there was a pandemic and everyone hid out in the library, and then they were like meeting Bukati, and they're like, oh, let's do like a bunch of stories, you know? But what happened is that as soon as I started writing it, suddenly the pandemic happened in reality. And then I was like, oh wow, this is like a signal from God or something, if there was a God. But
yes, there is.
and that says there is. I know you believe. But anyway, so I was like, wow, this is like a perfect coincidence. So and in my case, it really affected me pretty deeply. Like, first of all, I had a trip planned for Asia in the winter, I think February 2020, and I got very ill right before this. And I literally had to cancel my trip. I was that sick. And I was sick for about 6 weeks. And now I realized it was probably COVID, but I didn't know that at the time. As soon as I got back to work, so like a week later, we had to shut down for the lockdown. And may I remind you too, just a couple of days ago was COVID Remembrance Day, fifth anniversary, as Bill says, of the pandemic. And the 15th, which was yesterday, is when the first story came out, which I'll talk about also on the front line. It was actually the most intense story about how COVID was fought at Elmer's Hospital, where coincidentally my mom worked during the pandemic. And so, during the pandemic she was there, and so we were locked down, and then she got sick, and we all got sick. My dad was very sick from COVID. I thought he was actually going to die. We didn't want to go to the hospital. We were more afraid of going to the hospital than actually staying. Thankfully, he didn't pass away. But but my point is, it was very close to home. And we all had the antibodies and everything, so we all got it either through her or maybe I had it before. It's still unclear. But anyway, it was a very personal thing for me. Even though I was already writing this book, planning to write this book. So in any case, lockdown happened. We started to get out of the lockdown around in June, very slowly. And that's when I think the first time I went to the Hamptons, at first I was going to say, I was going to set it in the library, and then I was going to say in Queens, maybe upstate. And then I finally settled in the Hamptons, and I read an article about how a lot of rich people were escaping the pandemic to get away. Like basically the people who were dying were the people on the front lines, who were the working class, and people who were were workers, hospital, whatever they were. But the rich people, they were just heading out. And there's actually a book that was a bestseller at the time by Gary Scheinhardt, I can't remember that. Our Country Friends, that was kind of based around this. It's kind of based on a Jacobian style, which I'm going to mention also. But anyway, so that's where the idea of the Hamptons. And then I actually had an acquaintance from college who I didn't know so well, who lived in the Hamptons. I knew she lived there, so I just messaged her. She didn't respond the first time, but I followed up, and she was like, "Hey, how are you?" And again, I didn't actually know this person so well in college at all, but she was very happy to show me around. And so I went there, and she showed me around. It was the first of a few trips. And so I got to know the Hamptons very well for the frame narrative, and so that's where I set the book. And then for the individual stories, I came up with the most diverse set of characters I could. And then based around that, I had each character tell the story that I thought they would kind of more or less tell. And then I fit the style to the story. So, for example, one of the characters is named Kathy Wei Kwan. She's a 21-year-old social worker. She's a student of social work. And so she, went to Queens College. She's a spoken word artist, but she's also, she also did practicum at Elmhurst Hospital. She's involved, but she's very young also, and so she's very idealistic. And so with all the things that were happening during the pandemic, one of them was extreme anti-Asian hate, right, especially in Queens. and also the whole issue around undocumented or illegal immigration. And so I thought, well, she's a social worker, so she might tell a story that's like about, say, people of color or something like that, disadvantage, but maybe she won't want to appropriate terms of that, so she might want to tell a more personal story. So anyway, she tells a story about anti-Asian hate within the pandemic, but in the spoken word style, which is the one that she's familiar with, right? We have Taylor, who's a very conservative American. He's, like 10th generation or something from Rhode Island, blue blood. But he's a financial analyst, but he also did tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he actually, during the pandemic, he helped in the food lines when there were people starving, and even a lot of people who were illegal immigrants who needed food, and he actually helped out with that, along with another character in the book who's a superstar chef named Tiago. And it's funny when I'll talk about the frame story too. But so he tells a story that he's kind of very conservative, and so he tells a story about legal Ecuadorian immigrants who are kind of put upon by Mexican drug cartels, and then during the riots, in the BLM riots, he's also, they're also put upon by these elements. So it's a very dark story. It's a very tight story. It's the kind of story he would tell. But it's also a great story in the storytelling tradition. Kind of the exact opposite of Kathy's. So you'll see how all these stories kind of respond to each other. So there are 12 stories. There are 12 stories told by 12 characters. There are also, let me tell you also about the frame stories. So as you know, the Decameron, they all go out to the countryside, and they're living on this like dilapidated estate, kind of abandoned estate. Here we have a billionaire tech entrepreneur, who are people, by the way, who did pretty well during the pandemic because everyone was online suddenly, right? So he actually does pretty well. He owns a bunch of dating sites, among other things. And so, but he's also kind of like a philanthropist. So he creates this competition where people apply. They're single Americans of all types, ages, backgrounds, and he picks 12 of them to, right after the lockdown, to come to his complex in the Hamptons. There's like a huge mansion. He has a couple of other, properties too, which they also will go to during the course of the frame narrative. But so anyway, he picks 12 Americans who are very diverse in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, profession, age, sexual orientation, everything, right? And does that deliberately. And when they come there, that's when they realize that for 12 days and nights they're going to socialize with each other. They're going to play games. They're going to eat great food. Of all kinds of diverse, palettes. But at every night they're gonna have to tell a story as well. And so we have a kind of bachelor-like, I guess, reality show during the day, the frame story, and then you have the individual stories too. So that was a great challenge for me because, each story had to be great, and then the frame story had to be great too, which isn't true as much in the Decameron. Canterbury Tales was never even finished. So that was my great, challenge to myself narratively. And it took a while to get the frame story as good as the short stories. But I think in the one that I have, that I'm gonna publish, I think I reached it. And so, I'm very proud of that. Now, the next step was, how am I gonna put this out into the world? So my hope was that I could get a major publisher to publish this, and I would get a Pulitzer Prize or a National Book Award or something. But things don't happen that way. I mean, it's not for me, I guess. So after, quote unquote, wasting, I guess, a year and a half trying to get this book eventually published, I decided, as usual, to go it alone through my New Way company. I was like, this is a very dynamic book, so how do I publish it in the most unique way possible? And so I decided to publish a story a month as an ebook, starting yesterday, for COVID Remembrance Day and everything else. And then to come out with a part one of the book, 6 stories and a frame story, September 15th, another 6 stories over 6 months. second book in April. They'll have 2 separate paperback and hardcover books, which I can then send out to contests and all that stuff. But anyway, I think that was the best way to do it. So that's the way I'm doing it. And so, I hope you'll support me. I hope you support the series. I think that they're all the great stories. They're all entertaining in a way that I think most short fiction isn't, frankly. I mentioned Chekhov, for example. I mentioned that book, Our Country Friends, by Gary Scheinhardt, and Chekhov and James Joyce. So the modern story is kind of more of like a vignette where sort of the character has an epiphany or something like that. Whereas in the Cameron, the Canterbury Tales, we have a lot more exciting fiction where people are, making quick decisions. They're more like thriller-like elements and things, and romance and things like that. There's a much more greater diversity to it, so it very much diverts from that formula, which is also another reason why it couldn't get published eventually. So I'm very proud of that. And so I think that's pretty much it for the intro. A lot of these book launches, people do readings and stuff, and I think in this case, I'm not going to read from the book. The book is available for you easily to get online, and so you can check them out hopefully today or whenever. But we are going to have readings from other writers here. Because one of the other things that I've been doing is I created this collective of other independent authors, and we have our own website now, and we're really getting traction as a group, not just individually. A lot of those people will read today, and so will anyone else who wants to in the open mic portion. So in any case, I'm not gonna do the next thing, which is that I'm going to give you guys a quiz about, and the subject will be myself and some of my works, and just do the best you can. And then the other side of the page, yes, the second side of the page, there's going to be a story match. So some of you are a little bit more familiar with Bad Americans than others, but try your best. You'll have to match the character with the story. So some of them are a little bit more obvious than others, so try your best with that. And so I'm going to hand that out. Try your best. We'll grade them during the open mic, and then the winners will get a couple of prizes.
Nice.
You need to make more hats too.
Yeah, I need to make more hats and a lot more merch, but that's on the very long list. Thank you very much, Matt. All right, so let me get you that.
Next to yours, since Ben
Please go up, pause or keep it up.
I guess you can turn it off. Yeah.
Pause it.